Realistisch. Okay.
And then you die.
So, wir sind im
That's
Prinzip
nice.
jetzt.
Okay, we do it in English, don't we?
Yes, we're doing it in
Yeah,
English.
just wanted to say we need to switch now, although we could
Yes.
do it in German.
So I can
Yeah.
speak in English very well. I'm good. I can then. Okay, Dominik, sag mal,
Peep.
sag mal was.
Yeah. Wow. Peep. Anytime you like.
Okay, guten Abend allerseits. Wir sind wieder zusammengekommen für ein Kiron Talks Gespräch online in der Stratosphäre des Internet, um mit interessanten Leuten über interessante Dinge zu reden. Hoffentlich
Stop.
nämlich.
Stop. We're doing it in English. English, please.
All right, it's true.
Rewind.
Well, you see, interesting people sometimes need to be reminded of things, just like me. And there is this beautiful guest we have here, a part of our usual partners, Dominic Orr and Sabrina Konzok, who are part of Kiron and of SEND, the agency association in Germany for social entrepreneurs. This is also the keyword for the talk today, because our special guest, Gorgi Kirlev, he is working at the University of Heidelberg in the or near the faculty of sociology. And he is doing things, he's teaching people how to learn, how to finance their initiatives, and how to improve their social impact. These are the main keywords here. And Gorgi has just developed together with many other partners a MOOC, a massive open online course called AIR, which means accelerating investment readiness. And the other description of it would be financing for social change. So they are the keywords that we are having today for our talk. And we want to find out a little bit where is need in new enterprises, in new initiatives, in social entrepreneurial initiatives. Where is need of help? Where are structures impeding this progress and their success? And where can people maybe start with new ideas and even get money for it? Well, I would say, Gorgi, would you like to tell us a little bit what this Air MOOC is, so that we have a little better impression what you do?
Absolutely. So thanks very much for having me. Air MOOC is, well, as you said, it's called Accelerating Investment Readiness. So it really has a focus on social entrepreneurs and how they can join up with so-called impact or social investors. So the idea is to leverage the impact that these kinds of organizations can have through forging collaborations between investors and social enterprises. So we have this MOOC, the Massive Open Online course, but we also, within this EU Interact project, by the way, with a focus on Central and Eastern Europe, we also have a blended part, which means that the organizations that are taking the MOOC will also then have the opportunity let's see whether they are actually going to be offline workshops, but the idea would be to actually meet in smaller groups and dive more deeply into some of the issues that we're focusing on, and the contents that we have a focus on in Air MOOC range from impact and impact measurement to how to communicate best, especially towards investors. So we cover quite a broad range. And I think the particular benefit that we have with Air MOOC is that there are loads of MOOCs and online resources out there, but often they only focus on the ventures, or sometimes also at social innovation. So how ventures come together from different sectors as well, different actors in order to, well, innovate for society. But what we have is the specific focus of the intersection between social entrepreneurship on the one side and this new field of investing on the other. So this is, I think, in a nutshell, what Air MOOC is about.
May I just ask a little bit, what do you understand by saying social entrepreneurs? What kind of people come and ask to participate in your courses?
Yeah, so generally, I wouldn't make a distinction between non-profit and for-profit models. So basically, the core criterion for being a social entrepreneur for me, but also for us in the project and in MOOC, is that social impact is at the heart of the venture, right? So that you're trying to create value for society, no matter whether it's by a voluntary non-profit model, by an organization that originates from civil society, or maybe by a for-profit venture that's I don't know, is focused on green tech, for instance, or what has been described as tech for social good, where you have a solid business model behind it. We also relate to organizations that might depend on a hybrid financing model, meaning that they have earned income, but they might also have maybe state subsidies or even donations. So it's pretty broad in terms of the organizational types that we're addressing. The main focus is that they have a clear impact model, meaning that they can articulate how they want to make a positive change in the world.
Mhm.
So, and I suppose that's
Well,
also the key challenge, because if you're a for-profit, I mean, you shouldn't do it, but essentially your biggest value measure is, am I making a profit and how much? Is that part of what you look at? Is how all, because there must be many different ways of measuring impact. So what's the best way to measure impact, especially if you're talking to investors? Maybe that's kind of the key question.
Yeah. So you're totally right that there might be a trade-off in this, and actually in one of the modules that is dealing with strategy, we're looking at how there are these different types of business models. As I was saying, so one of the examples that we had where impact and the business model are sort of in line is a venture from Croatia, which is called Omo Lab. So they have developed a font and an app for people suffering from dyslexia. And I mean, whenever they grow this organization, they also spread the product, and that will be to the benefits of customers or of their target group, right? So there's not really much of a conflict here. But on the other hand, we also have very innovative approaches to, for instance, homelessness, where it's super hard to actually have a business model, right? So that's often still a non-profit voluntary model. But still there are very innovative approaches there. One example that we give is Straßenblues, which is an organization based in Hamburg. And what they've done, for instance, when the COVID crisis came, all of a sudden the people living on the streets didn't have someone passing by to give them a whatever, a cent or a euro or more or less than that. And so they actually used a donation platform to then let social workers distribute those donations to the people in need. So that was, I think, a very creative way of tackling a situation where people were in need. And this is also met by differences in the investor landscape. So we have some investors that you could call venture philanthropists, so that have a really strong environmental or social value set, but that still want to tackle this in an entrepreneurial way. And you also have very sort of financially oriented, as you were saying, investors that would then ideally invest in the type of ventures that are in line, where business and impact are in line. And what you see, I think, especially on the investor side at this moment, is that people are still sort of striving for having, in the ideal case, one single ratio or indicator that they can use in order to channel their investments. And I think that's usually the point where you say, well, you'll be disappointed, but it's not that easy. So I think what we're trying to advocate for also in the MOOC is that there are different kinds of value that need to be accounted for, both on the organization side as well as on the investor side. For instance, and that's sort of the last example I want to give before I sort of feed it back to you, is that, for instance, you can look at what kind of social relations are being built in the sense of what kind of networks are you creating, but also what kinds of ties and trust are you creating between people. One of the examples that we give here is quite well known in Germany, is nebenan.de, which is this neighborhood and neighborhood vitalization or connection network. And obviously, if you want to measure the kind of impact and value they are creating, it's not about the finance. It really is about the connections between people, the mutual support, which is super important, I think, especially in times of crisis like under Corona.
Totally. I mean, as you're just talking about the crisis, I mean, for sure, social innovations are one of the best tools right now, right, to cope with something that we haven't seen at the scale. But maybe coming a bit back to how you actually do it. I know that you set up some principles for the Air MOOCs or for the whole program and how to go about that. Like, what are they exactly, and why did you choose exactly those?
Mm-hmm. There are a couple of principles that we were trying to take at heart when we were designing the MOOC, as you've just mentioned. Some of those, I think, sort of originate from my experiences when I was doing my PhD at Oxford, and where I actually had one of the courses. So it was a part-time program, quite unusual, sort of an individual setup, working in Heidelberg at the Center for Social Investment, and then doing the PhD alongside. And I was quite struck by how they designed this one methods course. It was a stats course on top of everything else. And I quite liked the way they did this. And so based on that, I think I derived a couple of principles. One would be that we're trying to prompt thinking rather than understanding. So we deliberately try to slightly maybe overtax learners by not spelling everything out to the last detail, right? So we often give some references to text somewhere else outside the platform that we use for the learning and for the teaching, so that people, we hope, are going to be prompted to just dig deeper on their own and also have some individualized elements of learning in there. So that would be sort of the first principle. The second principle, and that's a bit due to the restrictions that we had in terms of budget and also the crisis situation, by the way. I mean, we were recording interviews with experts, and then all of a sudden there was lockdown and everyone was in their home offices. And well, how do you do that? So what did we do? We just recorded interviews on Skype, which meant that usually quality was lower. And we also never had a professional team because we couldn't afford it. So the thing that we did, or that I did, is go there, be the camera guy, be the one who asked the questions, and then record everything. But I think the second lesson or principle that sort of emerged by coincidence is that it's more about how striking the content and how elaborate the arguments the interviewees make, rather than how fancy the material is. At least I hope that. Because MOOCs tend to be very costly in production, and therefore also it's mainly the players who can afford it or who can then maybe make money with those by giving out certificates that are putting their expertise in there. And I think that's not a given thing, and there's more room to test and experiment with maybe lower quality in terms of how fancy things look, but high quality in terms of contents. And the third one was that we deliberately tried to avoid any small tools like quizzes, multiple choice questions, and so on. Because as we discussed earlier, Tino, in the preparation talk, this is really targeting executives, entrepreneurs, leaders of organizations, right? So what we want to do is not test whether they can reproduce what we've said in the module, but we really want to see whether they can apply some of the things that we have in Air MOOC to their organizations. So what we're prompting them to do is really apply these to their specific settings. So as we were talking about impact measurement, design or think about key indicators that one would need to apply to a specific social venture. And this also, I think this is a good principle, but at the same time, it also comes with the challenge that it's quite hard, especially in this MOOC setting, which is quite detached from interaction in some way, to actually get the people to do it and exchange with each other. So ideally, we would want to see that, and gladly we have the blended learning part to actually do that more actively. But what we see is that that's really a hard process, and I don't have a good answer to how you do that.
I mean,
Sorry,
something that
sorry,
you're working with?
Gorgi,
Go ahead.
the three principles, to take them home, could you sum them up once again in a short thing, each one, so that I can memorize it better?
Sure. So the first one was thinking instead of understanding. So because when you understand, you think, okay, I got it, but then you sort of stop applying it to yourself, stop to dig deeper. The second thing was have striking contents rather than fancy material. And the third one was rather than testing knowledge, trying to design scenarios where the people, the learners, the participants can apply what they've learned to their specific situation.
I mean, the nice thing I think for us is, you know, this is the 13th episode we have today. We're hoping it's not a bad luck one, but we keep on having the same topics coming up kind of almost all the time. And I think those three principles you've just said, they would fit to a lot of discussions we've had before. In fact, they pretty much describe how we want to do this podcast as well, because it was always, when we first thought of it, we thought, let's not do this complicated. Let's just try and make something happen. So no fanciness. And I completely agree also with the third one, not just for when you're thinking about executives, but generally, you know, why use these silly tools like all this gamification stuff? I always think, okay, there's a danger that we start treating people as if they're children again. And I think you also shouldn't treat children like that. You know, we want to kind of...
I think that's actually where the problem starts, isn't it?
Sorry. I just wanted to say, because one of the things that came up basically every time was also, because we're living in this COVID period, and the nice thing is we're all experiencing the same thing, which is how do you live and interact in this kind of remote space? And it's always about how can you create some kind of interaction and working together and feeling like you belong together without the physical bit. And I just really, for me, I just like to point that out again, that's kind of the big thing we've come up. But what I thought was quite nice when we were talking to Luca a number of episodes ago, he was talking about one way to try and get around this is to make sure if people feel like they're all working together on something, then they feel they're contributing to a community. And that means they feel more belonging in that community. And I think maybe also around your course, maybe you've managed to achieve that to some extent. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about who's taking part in the course and how they're interacting?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the benefits that we have obviously is that we still have this blended offline learning part that is built into or connected to the MOOC. And at the same time, we're also running a pitch competition for social enterprises where they can win some prize money, but that's actually the sort of, it's 10K for 4 winners. So that's not a massive amount, but I think it can still help, especially in developing innovation. But the core argument here is actually that we want to build community and especially bridge this gap between the enterprises and investors that were then also going to be on the investment panel. And ideally, our idea obviously would be that in the mid to long term, then there would actually be investments, right? Rather than just having the prize money to build or contribute to networks that are forming, but also have these one-on-one investments where the organizations can actually excel by help of an investor and the other way around. So I think this is one of the ways that we're trying to, as you were saying, build community, get some buy-in from different sides in order to make things happen. But I think also what we're seeing in research a lot, and that's also what we touched upon a bit earlier, is that often you don't really have these meeting spaces. And I often think you don't have enough time and space to actually do things together. So we're running from, I think it's got a bit better because we're not meeting that much physically anymore. So there's an efficiency argument here as well. But we're going to workshops, we're going to gatherings, practitioner gatherings, some dialogues. And all of that is super interesting. And a lot of it is very enriching. But oftentimes I think, well, I would have loved to sort of follow up on this, but I need to sit down and write this paper, for instance. And the other guy is going to think, I need to run this podcast or live streaming on YouTube, and yet another one is going to say something else. so often there's not really the opportunity to do something together. And also, I think whenever we think about innovation in particular, we have this expectation of there was this meeting, and so what was, I mean, again, thinking about impact, what was the impact? What was the outcome? At least an output. Come on, you need to come up with a new project idea or something. But I think that's actually not how innovation works, right? So you need to sort of build more protected spaces. And within this project, I think we have the opportunity to sort of do that artificially. But what I think, ranging from education, but also into other areas, is to just have more of these free spaces for people to create with each other. And that's one of the things, I mean, Dominic, what you've been saying, treating people like children, ticking boxes. Also, we have that in university education, right? Why do you have multiple choice questions? Because it's just a big bother to rate an essay as compared to, you know, feeding a machine with a multiple choice test and then letting it tell you whether that's a correct answer or not. But I think we need to make the effort, especially as we're talking about a crisis that no one really has any experience with. And so this is one of the occasions, I think, where you see you need people that come up with creative solutions, and that's the way how you nurture them, and not the way we're used to doing things.
Gogi, I think you said also that this MOOC perhaps could become a university course or could be part of university education.
Yep.
That means that this certain kind of, let's say, flexible thinking is something that is desired. And if it is, then it means that it also reflects some way of how a part of the economy now works, how certain startups, how companies, how the interaction between financing bigger companies, maybe smaller companies. Could you tell us a little bit? I mean, if this becomes a university course, then it, as I said, reflects a certain situation in which we are, in which the way of working changes. What do you think is this change? That don't talk about COVID so much, because this is also ending at one day.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't define our future, hopefully. Although some people would wish that everybody communicates forever online, but it's not me. And yeah, what do you think? What is this? What has changed? Well, how is the economic and structural situation that makes this kind of knowledge and teaching interesting?
Yeah, I think there's two areas. One area is a topical area where I think there's more and more appetite, even in German universities. And I think internationally we've been quite slow, focusing on sustainability, focusing on social impact, really trying to develop leaders, managers, staff, founders, whatever, civil servants who have this mindset. So it's, I think, a topical question. It's getting more into business schools, but it's also in organizational sociology and all of the social sciences, and probably also the humanities, and even, I guess, the natural sciences, especially when they have this connection to the business world, as you were saying, Tino, is making these more attractive. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that it's really about the method and the way of teaching and learning. So it's quite rare, I think, at least in my experience or to my knowledge, that you use something that is super practice oriented. So we said this is really focusing on executives. We have readings and that sort of stuff, but it's really also the exercises are focused on, think about your venture, how would you assess your impact? Think about your venture, how would you refine your strategy in order to really tackle the root causes of a social problem, these kinds of things. And I think there's more and more appetite also in university teaching to bring in this world of practice, bring it into university education. And what I see or what I've heard is that usually it's when it happens, it's rather the other way around. Some theoretical concepts are being transformed into a MOOC, and then the big universities are putting that on. And making it available to a broader audience. But in this case, it's really been the other way around. So we've really focused on the practice-oriented parts, and what we're now trying to do, because I think in both ways, it's sort of a waste, right? So this is really focusing on executives, but I think there's a lot for students to learn. and the other way around. So what we're trying to do, and we're actually just applying for a grant to be able to do that. That's another obstacle. Often you just don't have the resources to do it. But what we'd ideally like to do is make this available and also have it harmonized with criteria, ECTS criteria, having some readings, having some assignments, and that kind of stuff. What you need, and I think is important to have for a university course. We want to design that and then ideally also make it available open source. The course itself already is, of course, open source, right? Everyone can just register with an email and a name. That's it. So everyone can access it anyway. But also in higher education, everyone's sort of cooking their own soup, so to say. What we're trying to do is, as we're making these experiences, we also try to document those and just provide it to anyone who wants to use it in their university teaching. So that's the ideal scenario. Let's see how far we or how close we get to that. But that's sort of the idea behind. So it's a
Dominic, you said once that the universities are an old model and there are new things coming up that must be recognized as more structural and more important than just a new addition. On the other hand, it seems that also universities integrate this to stay how they are. What do you think? Do you think what is happening here actually?
I mean, of course, I'm always a great fan of these kind of things, and I think it's a great idea of. I mean, it's funny as you explain, Georgi, how this all developed, because it kind of developed out of, well, firstly, it developed obviously from a European project, but also kind of from an idea. And now it's the idea of, okay, can we actually reintegrate that into the higher education system? I mean, one could be disappointed that it happens this way around, because, you know, in a way we say higher education, we universities, we are exactly this protected space where we're being innovative. But I always think, I mean, innovation always comes through friction and through finding practical cases where you think, okay, we can't really understand this. But of course, there is the big, I mean, I'm thinking the whole time of, you know, one of the big questions or big topics in economics has always been social impact bonds. So it is kind of this idea of breaking that down and then connecting it to what happens if I have these hackathons that I've got at the moment. So I think it's, I mean, it's, as you say, it's like it's actually super current. But I also think what I'm interested in is back to this question of how do we measure impact? Because I also think, again, with a lot of these hackathons, then, I mean, I just heard the evaluation of one hackathon where they said a lot of the results weren't really ideas one can take forward. But I think this is a measurement question as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really great that you mentioned that. So obviously, I think the one that is in most people's minds the biggest hackathon of all times is it's VIA versus virus. Sabrina has been directly involved in that, at least through SEN. And I think that's a great example of how things can happen, also from, you know, just doing it, as you were saying it earlier. It's an opportunity. We just do it, right? No long planning, no expectations. Basically, let's just do it. You need some resources to do it, but then you just let it go. And what you see there, and we're actually currently thinking about designing a research project that doesn't only look at the ones that are visible after the process, right? You all know it. You had the hackathon, you had some ideas, and there's some sort of a voting, and then there's an accelerator taking the most promising ideas forward. But what you're saying, Dominic, is basically some ideas can't be taken forward, but maybe it's also the case that some ideas are simply too complex to be taken forward at that specific point in time. Then there's passion coming in as well. Some things are sort of usually more popular than other things. And what you also said, Tino, is this crisis is going to be over at some point. So maybe we're focusing on stuff that is relevant for the crisis, and that's sort of the setting. But at the same time, maybe we're overlooking stuff that might, you know, bear fruits further down the line. So basically, what we're thinking about is having a holistic assessment of impact in the sense of trying to not only focus on the organizations that have been, you know, financed afterwards, but really sort of going deep and broad in terms of surveying the participants of the hackathon in terms of what they thought their benefits were, right? Was this an idea that they took into their organization? So it didn't really, they didn't really realize a joint project, so they failed, objectively speaking. But at the same time, they maybe took something onward and became entrepreneurs in their own organization, or they continued without this funding program, or they made some valuable connections that didn't spur innovation but had some other benefit. So I think that's really where the impact measurement mindset, and also this differentiation and this dashboard approach to different sorts of value comes in, where you really need to think about also what kind of spillovers were there, what kind of effects did the hackathon have in terms of maybe forming or destroying trust in the population also. I mean, they're spending, well, one idea might be that citizens are saying they're spending tons of money without really knowing how much it was, but on these fancy projects that just came up, and we're really working hard every day to make an improvement. We're just not on the radar of this. So it could be also have deterioratory effects, I think. And in this way, it's important to have a broad mindset when you assess the impact of these kinds of things. And obviously, you can also apply that to educational formats as the MOOC. But yeah.
I mean, one thing I'm thinking of is, I've been very involved in the open educational resources kind of movement and things. And one of the questions has always been, how can we explain the value of open educational resources? And very often I've been in lots of meetings where that has then been described as, what is the business model? And over half of the people say, no, we can't have a business model because it's open. And I don't agree with that. But maybe you could say more to it. And I mean, maybe you agree with them and not with me. I don't mind.
I'm not entirely sure whether I agree on the business model side. I think I just have invested too little thinking into having an opinion on that. But in terms of just going for open education and also open science, I think that's quite a big transformation in how business models are structured. So, for instance, if you look at scientific publishing, it's the big publishing houses that used to have their big relevance when we still had printed papers. But now that everything's online, the production costs are quite low. You don't need, the big infrastructure behind it. So scholars are questioning, why should we pay these publishing houses? Let's just put it, it can still peer review is voluntary work anyway. So we're doing this for free for these big publishing houses because it's part of our community and part of our career. But actually, it's others profiteering. So I think there's definitely huge sort of impetus or transformational potential in this movement. The question is, how do you really design it? So who's going? There are costs, but who's going to sort of cover those?
Totally. And I mean, maybe to connect the dots between you two a little bit, I mean, why I feel very often innovation doesn't happen or gets stuck at some point is because you have to invest upfront, right? So you have to invest, even if, you pretty much don't have to invest cash in any sense, but you for sure need to invest your time and your energy to some extent. And also, like, that's something that I think hackathons and any other format can really teach, that if you are willing to invest a certain amount of time and just be open about the result in the end, then that already triggers that whole spiral, right? That you can go up or down depending on where you land, right? But that's, I think, the major problem, not only in the open source educational materials, but in any kind of innovation that you want to move forward, right? That you always ask for, when is the point that we get something out of it, and what will it be? Because you simply can't answer that question, right? And that's also an interesting shift that some of the programs are taking now as well, right? Like, for example, the BMBF call now for social innovation as well, to have like a multiple step process in order to really take an idea to a concept, to a first funding, and then to a second bigger funding. I think there's also a big mindset shift that's currently starting to happen in institutions.
Yeah, I love that point totally, and that's what we've been seeing for I would say ages. I'm not that old yet, but for years. So especially when we're talking about social innovation. So when you talk to people, well, there's this argument of innovation occurs when there are people on the ground who really understand the needs of target groups, for instance, right? If you have no clue, if you sort of design something from scratch, it's just going to miss the needs that people actually have. So we were looking at nonprofit organizations, the free welfare associations in Germany, and their contribution to social innovation. And actually, you sometimes think of them as sort of the big conglomerates that are really hard to steer and that are sort of dedicated to old patterns, but you see a lot of innovation happening there. But even those big organizations, when we're conducting these interviews years back, we're saying what we often see is that even when you have specific funding to develop an idea, it's often maybe foundations or maybe some federal initiative that is funding these ideas. But then we have a great beacon project. It's super successful, and then after 3 years or after 5 years, the funding is gone. And the foundations are saying we're moving to something else because we want to spur innovation. The problem often also is to actually get attraction and have this as a good role model, first of all, to sort of steady it, but then also to be able to serve as a role model for others. And I think that's also the discussion that you have between, and this clash between social entrepreneurship and other established actors. The point is not to work against each other. The point is, how do you sort of transfer it from one sphere to another? Obviously, and we know that from entrepreneurship research or from innovation research, the smaller ones, smaller teams, lower hierarchies help innovating. That can also happen in an entrepreneurial fashion in organizations. But the point really is, how do you get the actors together, right? So how do you get an innovative idea and concept of a social enterprise into maybe a big welfare association? And also the thing that I think we totally neglect because it's so unsexy is how do you change policy? It's always, I'm an entrepreneur, what do I have to do with policy? But the point is, once you have an innovative social service, for instance, your main goal would be to have a lever on policy, right? To actually make this a regulation, to make this an established new service. And then you can go on innovating. But the point is, you really need to get to this point. Which brings us back to some of the educational contents that we have in MOOC, where we have a portrait of Alyssa McDonald-Burple, who's the founder of the Cacao Academy. She started off selling chocolate bars, fair trade, organic. But then at some point she thought, well, the only way I can scale is to enlarge my organization. And then I buy more land and I produce more fair chocolate. But the point, my lever is too small, right? So what she shifted her sort of business model to is provide education to farmers. And now she's pairing up with some people at Harvard, where they have this chocolate and cacao institute. And what they focus on is really transferring these learnings to policymakers, right? Influencing standards and also influencing big business, right? The point, especially in commodity industries, is to have the shifts in big business where they reassess their supply chains, they reassess their standards. So it's really about this transfer. And again, this is sort of one of the examples that we're using in MOOC in order to sort of prompt entrepreneurs to think about it that way. So what she always uses this idea of having these little bullets, and you start sort of shooting your bullets, and that's actually from a business book also, this idea. And then if you want to have the real big impact, you need the cannonball. So think about what your cannonball is going to be, or how you can get something into the air, so to say, to bring it onto a larger scale. I think that's the big question that we have. It's also going back to Tina, what you were saying, how do we transform how business is being conducted? I think it's really about how do you find these people who are brokering between the spheres, who are bringing impulses from one area to another, and thereby bring them to fruition, because single actors are not going to change anything.
I think you're right. I think also whenever you focus on the social space, then of course that's a big difference to just being in the free market. So that's the point where, of course, you have to connect it to policy. I mean, one of the other things taking to scale is, of course, the whole investment question. And I'm wondering, you know, are there some rules of how a social enterprise should talk to investors? Are there a few kind of things you could pull out from your knowledge on that?
Sure. Yeah. The surprising thing actually is, and that's also research based. So in a sense, we're also transferring. We're not so much transferring the educational principles of universities into the MOOC, but more the research goes into it directly. So there is a connection between universities and this more practice oriented course. And what we see surprisingly is that no matter to which kind of investor you're talking to, whether they are more the venture philanthropy type or the sort of ESG investor type that comply with environmental, social, and governance standards, but otherwise really focus on profit. It's that you need to convince them that you care about and that you have an effective response to the social problem. So it's really about starting with that. If you start by talking about the business, you're not going to be as successful or not successful at all as compared to if you start about the social problem, your response, and then obviously there's two different types of investors. If you have more of the venture philanthropist, then maybe you will need to explain your engagement, your voluntary experience, talk more about your values, and then if someone's really and that's sort of a bit of a low-brainer, but still confirmed in research. If you have a finance-first investor, then they will want to see more of that. But the core argument is here, don't start talking about your venture and your nice business model and where you're going to be in 5 years. That's a second step. The first one, and you need to nail that, is the social problem and your effective response to it. And that's where it comes to, apparently it's ingrained in ourselves that we're really looking for impact. Only if we try to sort of pin it down, if we're trying to translate it into some sort of accounts, then all of a sudden it all gets too complex and we want this one figure that tells me, this is my return on investment. But otherwise, it seems to be something, and probably Rutger Bregman, who always, the guy who sort of mashed up Davos last year, I think, quite a bit, who says, we have this social fabric in ourselves that cares about things. Maybe it's that. I can't really explain it, but that's one of the main messages, I think, in terms of how you successfully draft communication.
Oh yeah, I also see kind of an ideological problem. You know, on one hand, although others wouldn't agree, I really appreciate all the activity that is taking place in this form and how people are being social entrepreneurs. I want to taste this in advance and not to give the impression that I don't like this kind of an initiative. I think, on the contrary, that there's a lot of micro activity that is also new, or at least only 20 years old. No, so this is new. But also see, I want to know. I mean, and there's something that you say social impact. You say even social innovation, and then you say the social problem. You mentioned the homeless initiative to collect money for people who can't get it on the street. You mentioned Nebenan, an online platform that is helping neighborhoods to communicate. I'm sure that some employees will make their living off that, and I see a problem here. I mean, the only reason why startups and all this, let's say, diverse investment is now happening is the fact that there's too much money somewhere. And there are big, how you call these big BlackRock, these big investment companies and their subsidiaries who have the money to put it into these micro activities. So the micro activities profit from this accident. But on the other hand, I wonder also educationally, if you put a student or a person, if you give him the idea that social impact, entrepreneurial impact, the business impact is all the same, and innovation could even be applied to a problem like homelessness, then I wonder a little bit, I mean, don't you like blur the perception of a social problem by putting it together, everything together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, potentially that's sort of a threat. I totally agree with your point on that. I think the point is also that we shouldn't try and build alternative structures. So I would always see social entrepreneurs less as the sort of the deliverers of the big solution and also impact investors, by the way, but more of change agents in order to transform the bigger system. So one of the arguments being that actually impact investing is never going to be as such the main market, but it can be a beacon or a role model in terms of transforming how finance is done at large. The same thing is if you have social entrepreneurs, it's maybe not even only their innovations or their business models or whatever it is, their outside impact. It might also be the practices that they're applying internally, right? So that they usually have lower hierarchies. You talk about holacracies where you have a lot of participation in the organizations. So they might also be a role model in terms of how you transform how we work together. And so the argument is that you need to sort of have these as change agents, so to say, of a bigger system. I totally agree that we can't, on the one hand side, continue with business as usual. That's also this argument after COVID. We need to change everything. Basically, I totally agree. I don't really see it happening yet, but that's sort of the goal that we should work towards, rather than have one system breaking things up and then another system fixing the things. And also relating to this point that you made, that now all of a sudden everything is investment, everything is innovation, everything is nice and fancy, and you just need to put on your thinking cap, and all of a sudden you'll have an innovative business model with which you can solve homelessness. I think that's not the case, right? One thing is you still need this spectrum between for-profit models, non-profit models. We also need to be more appreciative of voluntary work of non-profit models, and only by having this diversity of approaches, but trying to sort of lever the effectiveness those have. Are we going to change something? And maybe one last point. There's this nice concept pioneered by Michael Porter from Harvard Business School of shared value, right? So you just need to find a creative solution to social problems that everyone's going to benefit. I think what we're often seeing is that these promises are hard to hold and hard to live up to, and that and that's something my colleague likes to say. Christian Selos, there is no shared value, there is only shared pain. So in a sense, you really need to sort of accept some of the trade-offs. You really need to reactivate your values more. You need to collaborate. You need to be willing to make some sacrifices, right? You can't. I think you just can't have it all. But I also think that there's some momentum. More and more people believing that, and hopefully by that and by these change agents, as I've sort of outlined earlier on, hopefully we can have a bigger transformation. And we're talking about systems change. We're not talking about fixing stuff that others break. We're talking about, ideally, whether we're ever going to achieve it, I've got no clue. But this would be sort of the goal that organizations and people should be working towards.
We will achieve it always again, that's for sure. No, there's a change taking place, and the COVID-19 crisis didn't fall from the sky. It's also a signal of how our society works badly in some regards, especially for land expansion. There is a change in the way companies develop new ideas by having this really great startup culture. And there's through technology and these people with open education, like Dominic and Sabrina, show how the access for learning and the sharing of these things are developing in a very, very fascinating way now. And well, we can't change the world just right now, but we can try piece by piece. Our time is a little bit over. I wonder if Dominic and Sabrina still want to ask you some more holes into your stomach. So let's do a last round.
For sure. Do you want to start?
If you've got a question, then you should go, because I
have a question, and I can turn it into a wrap up as well. No, but I will leave it with the question. So as you said, like in the end, you talked a lot about interdisciplinary work as well, right? And about how we can change different sectors of society and different issue areas and whatever. So if you look at the education sector, I mean, you could think, of course, there's a lot of innovation happening already, for sure. But in comparison to other industries, I always feel it's still a bit lacking behind, given all the challenges that we have ahead, right? So only given all the numbers of people that will need to be upskilled and reskilled, and all the new technologies that don't even exist yet, but we need people educated in them as fast as possible, as soon as they're there. So how do we get there, and what would be your best guess how we can come up with those innovations that are needed to tackle all those educational challenges?
Yeah. So I think once again, the point here is collaboration, right? So what you see happening, we're back at Dominic's argument about hackathons. There's a hackathon that sort of rethinks education. But then again, I think, first of all, you don't have the protected spaces. You don't have practices that generate interaction on a daily basis. That's one of the things that needs to happen. And at the same time, that's just what I suspect. But I would suppose that most of the people that are then taking part in the hackathon are not really deeply in the system, right? So it might be people that have great ideas from outside, but in a sense, it's again this idea from, I'm going to be there and rethink everything from scratch. I mean, take Richard David Precht, a philosopher who tells everyone how to, revolutionize education. Some of the ideas I think are good and okay, but at the same time, I think maybe it needs a bit more grounding in the sense of maybe asking, teachers about their experiences, trying to enable them to actually change something. Same in higher education, right? Quite hierarchical still, quite rigid institutions usually. And you don't have much agency, so to say, in the individual change agents. And I think that's actually how you promote it in terms of if you want to have some change in the institutions. If you're looking outside, if you look at impact broadly again, I think the good news is that ubiquity is getting more important than, copyrights and keeping things for yourself. So it seems that sharing, giving out stuff, again, this idea of then making the online course, the university course open source and not keeping it to ourselves to have sort of selling point or something like that. We're not a business school, but maybe that's something that they would have been doing, and I think it's transferring to this. And I mean, the examples that you're setting through Kiron and other open-minded and open, I would say, educational initiatives and platforms are actually helping this transformation to make it to the benefit of a broader target group or audience.
Mm. Maybe I just add a few things to that, because I agree with what you've said. I actually think, because we're noticing now that, especially with the hackathons, they've become now the new method of choice for lots of things. But I do find it interesting. And I think part of it, especially if we think kind of past the hackathon, the social enterprise that then starts being built on that, and Kiron would be one example. In a way, what's interesting, and maybe what makes these enterprises to a certain extent innovative and pushing the boundaries, is actually because they are an unprotected space. So suddenly they do have to deal with questions like, how am I going to ensure that I've got enough money to keep moving forward? How can I make sure that it fits in the whole system? I mean, I have sometimes the feeling in the public sector, the reason we don't move forward is actually because a lot of that is kind of protected through the answer of, no, we always do it this way. And so whilst I'm really against the point also that Tino was making, I'm really against this solutionism, which just says, no, come on, we can, it's also called sometimes the Silicon Valley approach, which is, we need to break the whole system and we've got a new one just around the corner. That is, especially in the social sphere, that's rubbish. But I think this kind of getting out there where it's dirty and like really trying to make things happen is actually why social enterprises are so interesting. And I think I totally agree with you. I think they're interesting of themselves, but they're interesting as role models as well for other people to look at and say, hey, that works as well. And I think we know, certainly as Kiron, that that's how we're seen within the space. When policymakers talk to us or other institutions, they come because they're like, we never would have believed this could work, but it obviously works. So, I think it's really great that you're working in this area, and especially with the investment question, because I think, again, probably that's the most unsexy of all the questions, because for a startup, that seems to be the easy thing, because you're like, come on, we just do something, a little idea, and we find some investor who comes and gives us some, the first 5 million or whatever. But it's much more difficult, I think, for a social enterprise. But I think it's really important to focus on the topic.
Yeah. Maybe one last reflection. I think you're making a great point in terms of that you need to strike a balance to find the right kind of liberty and protected space. I think on the one side, too much pressure is not good because you're only going to run after your job. Nothing's going to happen. And at the same time, it can also lead to just people leaning back. That's the way we always did it. And I think the sort of the ultimate proof for all kinds of practices is the crisis, right? All of a sudden, we're making things happen. All of a sudden, we need to teach online, whether we want it or not. We could have, as many have done, just sort of reject these or use them poorly, the opportunities that we had. And now you actually need to make things happen. So actually, we've also, in terms of reskilling and getting to cross-sector partnerships to integrate refugees, by the way, we've seen that crises were actually focal points where people that made people and organizations move where they otherwise wouldn't have. So it's a bit it seems on the individual level, you need, I think, more agency, more protected space. And at the same time, you sometimes also just need the pressures and some sort of an impetus that is pushing things towards whatever goal. Maybe it's just the pressure. I'm not entirely sure, but it's finding the delicate balance between the two, I guess, that matters in terms of really effectuating change.
Well, I'm looking forward to the Wikipedia of social entrepreneurial ideas that everybody can take and use. Thank you, everybody, for...
We've already got a name.
Yeah? What is it? What is the name?
The Wikipedia for changing the world. Maybe.
Your name.
Well, it should be specific enough to distinguish it from something else, however.
That makes sense.
Well, thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. Thank you for all everybody who has listened. We'll try to be back next week with another interesting thing. Dominic, is there another important... Dominic, sorry. I am so bad in wrapping up. There was this important online event of Kiron last weekend. Could you just tell us, but briefly, how did it work and what's next?
Great. Yeah, thank you. I also forgot that as well, because we're all moving from one thing to the next. Yeah, we had over 1,500 people. We had lots of refugees taking part in the conference, which was always our goal. And we're going to be issuing all participants with badges, so micro credentials, because this is something we want to be working on more, and Kiron as well. And of course, we always said the conference was very much the start of something that we want to be moving forward in. And I mean, for myself anyway, I was very excited and super happy about what happened. So Sabrina, do you want to add a few words to that?
Totally. I mean, we can only say that everyone who missed it, we have all the recordings from all the sessions. So there's so much interesting things, like also maybe for you, even a visualization of social good. So like we had a session there that was really, really interesting of how to use data to show more social needs and challenges, but also to show a way of how you could tackle them. That was interesting, but really a broad range, even language courses and sessions. So yeah, for everyone, virtual refugee conference. Maybe that's what you should mention as well, the link, and there you will find everything else.
Yeah, and everything else that Georgi mentioned, we'll put at the bottom as well of this post.
Cool.
You have the last word.
Well, no, I just say thank you and goodbye. Good night. What is it? Good luck and good night. What was the journalist?
That's right. Yeah. Thanks very much. Okay. That was really great. Thank you. Very much.
Thank everybody.
Cheers.
See you soon.
Thanks a lot for having me. Bye.
Bye.
Ah,